My grandmother's name was Inez. She stood about 5 foot 5 feet tall. She rarely ever carried a purse. She carried a gun. She lived out in the country to the right of the railroad track. Her house sat and still sits in between Port Hudson, Scotland, and Baker, Louisiana. I remember my grandmother used to put green olive oil brand perm in her hair along with pink and blue rollers. Not only that, but I remember my grandmother using the olive oil brand hair sheen, blue magic grease on her hair. My grandmother never wore makeup, but she would rub Vaseline on her face and her lips. I remember my grandmother would brush her teeth with baking soda and keep a cough drop or peppermint in her mouth. I remember my grandmother would throw mothballs in the corner insides of her house and outside of her house, as snakes were common in the country. I remember my grandmother had a rose bush beside the right side of her house. Not only that, but I remember my grandmother had plum trees, grapevines, and a compost container. And I remember my grandmother grew yellow squash out of the ground, red tomatoes out of crates, and marigold flowers out of flower pots. Not only that, but I remember my grandmother would tell me, "Two, you got to pull that weed up from the root." You see, when you plant something beautiful, you have to look out for weeds that try to grow up as well. I remember my grandmother would get on her riding lawnmower and she would cut her grass in a square. I remember my grandmother saying that cutting her grass was one of the joys of her life. Well, that's all I have for this episode of Casey Taylor Sings. I Remember My Grandmother, the limited YouTube series, episode 1. But while I'm here, I want you to know that my latest blues single, I Remember My Grandmother, the extended version, will be released April 5th, 2026 on Easter Sunday. It will be available on all digital streaming platforms. Right now, it is available for pre-save and pre-order via Spotify. Thanks for tuning in, and be on the lookout for the next episode next Wednesday to be posted on YouTube at 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I'd like to dedicate this record to the loving memory of my grandmother, Inez Marie Jones. This one is for you. Yeah.